Welcome to the Den of Dissidents. This is a show where we challenge the current culture and mainstream talking points of the day. What is the news telling us? What is the culture telling us? Where's our civilization headed? And by what standard do we judge these issues? Are you a dissident? Let's find out. Welcome back to the Den of Dissidents. Today I have special guest Chuck Littleton. He's host of Teach 'em Chuck. He has his own YouTube channel where he gives political and social commentary with deep research in an aggressive urban style. He's also a co-host of Cutting Through the Culture. And I have Chad Jackson, Dallas-based entrepreneur, researcher, and filmmaker of Uncle Tom 1 and 2, and also host of Cutting Through the Culture. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Absolutely. Thanks for coming on. So I'm just going to jump right into it. MLK Day is coming up. I've seen a lot of your commentary talking about MLK, some of the research, Martin Luther King. I wasn't aware of a lot of research, but I'm starting to dig in as far as who he was, the civil rights movement and so forth. So here's the question. We're taught that Martin Luther King was a great moral Christian leader that was fighting for civil rights. Were we taught the correct thing about Martin Luther King? Is he the man that we were taught he was?
You want to go first, Chad?
I'll go first. The short answer is no. The short answer is no. And I'll go directly to his own papers to prove this point. Fact number one, he did not believe in the resurrection of Jesus, which the whole of Christianity is centered on the fact that Jesus was who he says he was or is, and that he died, rose again, and ascended into heaven. Without the resurrection, there is no Christianity at all. And so someone who professes to be a pastor or a preacher of the Christian faith has to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. As early as the age of 12, Martin Luther King says that he rejected the notion or the belief that Jesus rose from the dead. He considered himself to be an intellectual. His true passion was wanting to go and be a university professor. But he was advised to go into the pastoralship, go into, the church, be a pastor. You can make a lot of difference in that particular position. So he went into that position, having a stronger passion for Marxist ideology than he did, seeing people and seeing souls being won to Christ. And so this is important to understand first and foremost, before you really get into, okay, well, what was his actual agenda as the, so-called leader of this civil rights movement? If not to win individual souls to Christ, what in fact was his agenda? And I think we're going to unfold that answer as this particular podcast progresses.
Right. Yeah, I second that, Chad. Just to take it a step or two further, King even viewed, once again, like Chad mentioned, you can go and, read his work, his papers online. I think, you can probably get to all of them, quite frankly, free of charge. They're out there. I think, what is it, Chad? I think the Stanford Press.
Archive.org.
Archive. Okay, yeah. So going back to what Chad was saying, just to take it a step or two further, he even thought that the idea that Christ was divine in an ontological sense, meaning that the divine nature of Christ was, inherent in his being, he viewed that to be detrimental to man's development. See, like Chad mentioned, as far as Dr. King in his adherence to these Marxist philosophies, of course, we'll probably get, more so into the philosophical background of this particular line of thinking. But, it centers around this notion of perfecting society. And of course, if you must perfect society, first and foremost, you have to perfect man. And if you consider the fact that, Christ was divine and separate from man in a way that pretty much man could never be, in his mind, that was a hindrance to a man sort of fulfilling his true potential. Okay, so you have to separate God from everyone else. And according to King at the time in the 1950s, and of course he kept this with him until his death in 1968. It's not like he changed his beliefs, but he believed that what made Christ divine was his feverish adherence to the commands of his God, his Father. And so you too, as a human being, can be essentially divine if you would have that same level of commitment to do what is moral, what is just, and what is righteous. Of course, that would, take on a sort of subjective nature, because you would have to ask, or at least try to do your research into what Dr. King believed to get a sense of what that meant to him, what it meant to be righteous, and what it meant to be moral. It certainly wasn't in line with the teachings of the Bible. It was more so in line with the teachings of the social gospel, which is, of course, a heretical perversion of the gospel.
Right.
Yeah,
it's a subversion.
Yeah, I was reading that, and I think on the Stanford site, where there was a paper in which he wrote about the divinity of Christ, and a portion of it reads that King dismisses the conception of an inherent divinity in Jesus and concludes, quote, "The true significance of the divinity of Christ lies in the fact that his achievement is prophetic and promissory for every other true son of man who is willing to submit his will to the will of the Spirit of God." And I think it also said something like Christ wasn't always divine.
No, yes, he didn't believe that Christ was always divine. What made divine? I mean, you just pretty much alluded to it, Rashad, there. That what made him divine was his acts and what he was able to do and what he was able to accomplish. Right? He wasn't, metaphysically bestowed with this kind of divinity that we, associate with, with God, or these things that are godly. So yeah.
I think I walked away reading a portion of that, concluding that what he's saying is that if you too can be like Christ, if you submit to the will of God, or you can be another Christ, just like Christ submitted his will, that's when he became divine. So if you submit to God, you can become divine.
Right.
In a sense, that's what
so I walked away from. What are your thoughts on that, Rashad?
Oh, I think it's, I guess I'd say heretical. I mean, definitely not what Scripture says. I mean, Christ was divine. He's the I am,
Yeah, I mean, because it's interesting. I mean, even whenever Jesus is born, I think it's in the Gospel of Mark, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. Sometimes I get the four Gospels mixed up in terms of who said what. But there were two elderly people who came to Mary and basically talked about how this is the Messiah who has come and is, going to fulfill the scriptures, so to speak. So from his inception, Jesus was always divine. It wasn't, something that happened later in his life. That goes without saying. But I don't know, to take it back to your original question about what was it that Martin Luther King believed? Was he this great pastor that everybody believes that he was? Again, this is a long way of just saying, no, he was not. And that's important to note, because when it comes to Martin Luther King in particular, it's interesting. And I think Chuck gets this too all the time when he talks about Martin Luther King and who he really was and what he really believed. the number one pushback you get from people is, well, none of us are really perfect, right? Nobody's really perfect. And so this is their way of saying that even if he was really Marxist, or even if he was really an adulterer, even if he really was this, this person, none of us are really perfect. You have to look at the good side of him. You have to look at the speeches that he gave. You have to look at what he did in this country for civil rights and all the things. That's what we remember him for, not for the other stuff. But the reality is, when it comes to Martin Luther King, it's not a simple matter of him being imperfect like all of us are. The fact is, he was a deceiver.
Right.
He professed to be a man of the cloth, a shepherd of God's flock, so to speak. So he was able to do this subversive thing while deceiving people. And he was very mindful and very knowledgeable of what it was he was doing. He wasn't duped. He wasn't in the dark. He wasn't merely a pawn, although he really was. But, he understood full well what he was doing. He knew he was deceiving people. And that, in my opinion, and not only in my opinion, but according to the scriptures, is a true and high offense, because the Bible says that those who profess to be teachers will be judged more harshly. So this is something that we have to take into consideration.
Well, can I add? What about say something, Shop?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add too that, just echoing the sentiments of his father, when his father spoke about his ministry. He said that, that his ministry was concerned with man's lot in this life. Okay. And like Chad was speaking about, the reason why this is so troubling for someone who professes to be not just a Christian, but a man of the cloth, who, of course, like Chad just said, will be judged more harshly. Again, you can kind of see this link. And then for those who try to deny, for example, that, Dr. King was a member of the Communist Party or was a small c communist in terms of his ideology, they want to deny it and say this and say that. But you don't have to necessarily come out and profess to be that in order to be that. As a matter of fact, you learn up front, the tactics of subversion. Of course, someone in Dr. King's position would never openly admit to being such a thing. And this, of course, because we have the personal testimonies, in the sense of those who were close to King and who were around him, who said that MLK gave them explicit instruction not to detail exactly, who he was and his political and his social philosophy. But again, and the reason why that is so contradictory and antithetical to Christianity is because this notion of a social gospel, what it does is it does exactly what those who criticize, our system of or our free market economic system. I put it that way. To say things, it promotes greed, it does this, it does that. But in fact, that the ones who are criticizing our free market system are the ones who have taken man and reduced him to a material animal. But on the flip side of that, as far as Christianity is concerned with the whole of the man. But first and foremost, Christianity is not so much concerned with his material lot, but Christianity and the salvation of man is concerned, of course, with his soul and with his, with his spirit. All men are equal in the eyes of God and nowhere else. And when you start talking about, a temporal life or this finite life, when you start talking about things such as, inequality and the rich versus the poor and all this stuff, we'll get into that because, that was a part of Dr. King's shtick. But again, people like him, this is the type of stuff that they promote whilst calling themselves Christian, when in fact, man are equal in the eyes of God in terms of his soul, but nowhere else. Mm-hmm. And so you can see how heterodox, how much of a heterodox type of principle this is, because it turns man into nothing more than a material animal. It reduces him.
Okay. Chad, you said that he was a deceiver, and I think I've watched one of your videos where you say he was involved with some nefarious activities. Now, people from the outside looking in who have basically no knowledge of this side of MLK are probably like flabbergasted at what you're saying. So how was he intentionally deceiving people? What were his nefarious ways? That goes to both of you.
Well, people mistake the whole nonviolent tactic as being something that originated with Martin Luther King. This couldn't be further from the truth. I'm going to say that and then give it to Chuck, and then I'm going to pick back off of what Chuck says, if you want to take it from there, Chuck. Just the whole civil rights movement kind of being predicated on this tactic of nonviolence.
Yeah.
I think Chuck can speak to that part of it better than I can, but then I want to take it back off of that.
Well, yes. Well, he used this, tactic of he used a tactic of violence by promoting nonviolence because, of course, he wanted the, media to capture images of, himself and his followers, many of whom, if not most, were teenagers and young adults, because they, scoured the country, looking for young, impressionable teens who were participating in these protests to the chagrin of their adult parents. There's just another side note that many people don't know is that the civil rights movement or groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in particular had a very difficult time recruiting adults to their ranks. They were just too busy living life and doing whatever it is that they were doing. But again, it was so deceptive, this whole tactic of nonviolence, because, Dr. King wanted himself, again, and his young followers to be seen as these victims, to be abused and to be beaten. And of course, his idea was to, and I think this was a quote of MLK's, that, allow these images. We want these images to go around the world so people can, see our plight and see the way in which, the United States is abusing us and mistreating us and oppressing us. And so you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, because when the state responds in kind to your social disruption, then, of course, they are made to look like the bad guys. This tactic was outlined. I know I was sifting through your some of your episodes, Rashad, and I think you had an episode way back when you spoke with G. Edward Griffith. And, G. Edward Griffith, he highlights this in his 1982 documentary called No Place to Hide, the tactics of, what is it called? The tactics of terrorism. And he talks about this, and so, yeah. So, I mean, again, MLK was a deceiver in many ways, but when you're talking about nonviolence in particular, I mean, that speaks to it. For sure.
Chad, you said you wanted to say something. I'm going to chime in right after you.
Yeah. So on the whole nonviolence front, again, as Chuck said, and I couldn't have said it any better myself. This is why I deferred to him to talk about that angle of it. When you look at the whole concept of the whole freedom riders and SNCC and how like they are the true individuals who are able to make the whole Martin Luther King being enshrined in American folklore possible. Without them, there would be no Martin Luther King. Without Stanley Levison, there would be no Martin Luther King. Without Bayard Rustin, there would be no Martin Luther King. These are the individuals who were able to assist with making him this kind of force to be reckoned with. Stanley Levison was the proverbial, publicist for Martin Luther King. He was the one who originated the idea of starting the LCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I think last time you interviewed me, Rashad, I had mentioned, I think, that briefly. And I also mentioned the the National Baptist Convention, which was led by Mr. Joseph H. Jackson. And I misspoke last time. I said he was born in 1915. He was actually born in 1900. He was born in 1900, so he would have been 15 years old when Booker T. Washington died. He died in 1990, which was the year that I was born. So I slip of the tongue. But the Black masses, especially in the South, overwhelmingly embraced not only Joseph H. Jackson, but the teachings of Joseph H. Jackson, which were, true and faithful to the orthodoxy of the scriptures, the fundamental principles of the scriptures. He preached repentance and being born again and individual salvation, and how it's on the person, on the individual, to make Christ your Lord after having repented. These are the things that Joseph H. Jackson taught. And Martin Luther King and his contingent, they wanted to, in a sense, oust Joseph H. Jackson and posture, Martin Luther King's contingent as the leaders of the National Baptist Convention, because they thought that by doing this, they can, in a sense, subvert the convention to being more in line with the social gospel as opposed to the fundamental gospel. But they were unsuccessful in doing this because Jackson stayed the president of the convention well into the 80s. And so that gives you an idea of what particularly Black Southerners, Black Christian Southerners, where they were theologically and otherwise. And so after having been kicked out of the convention, Stanley Levison, who was a white Jewish, communist, very well connected, very wealthy, it was his idea to start something called the Southern Leadership Conference, and they later changed the name to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to give Martin Luther King a platform that's backed by a organization that has a stake in the game, so to speak, when it comes to civil rights for Blacks in America. You needed to have some kind of organization in order to be taken seriously. Right. And so again, a lot of what the SCLC was doing, and SNCC, which was a kind of a little sister of the SCLC, was all meant to kind of give this facade that we are an organization that is truly concerned for civil rights for Black folks and is truly trying to fight this white supremacist regime in the South. And, the Freedom Riders were also a part of this, and they came down and they demonstrated marches and all these things without pulling permits, without doing the necessary things that groups would ordinarily do in order to make a point and do their demonstration and then go home. As Chuck said, they would go and recruit folks from, kids from high schools and from colleges, youngsters, get them involved in the movement, and, strategically tell them, wear your Sunday dress, come off as though you are doing no one any harm. And they were going into these places knowing full well what they were actually doing. And the whole point of this is they knew that these local governments, the sheriff's department, so on and so forth, will implement force if need be to try to disperse these crowds and get these unlawful crowds and get them to, break up and stopping traffic and all the things. And as soon as this would happen, the cameras would roll and these images would be on the front pages of the newspapers around the world. And that would, in a sense, pull on the heartstrings of the masses and win more and more numbers to the cause of civil rights. The idea being that this is how Blacks are being treated regularly on a daily basis in the South, not knowing that the whole thing was a dramatization. It was theatrics to get people to move a certain way. And so again, these are tried and true tactics, Marxist tactics that have worked for a very long time. And what Martin Luther King was doing was no different than the way that these have been tried and successful in the past. And so when people look at the conditions, quote unquote conditions, and the hoses and the dogs and the this and the that, this is what they think of when it comes to understanding why Martin Luther King was necessary. He was necessary because we were treated so badly in the South. When the reality is the same way that they dispersed these crowds of black youngsters was the same way that they dispersed other predominantly white crowds in unions and strikes and things of that nature. They got the dogs out, they got the hoses out, same thing. But again, we think of black folks and we think that black person couldn't even walk down the street without white folks, coming after them with dogs. And like, this is what we have. This is the image that we have in our minds. So again, I could go on, obviously, but these are the things that make Martin Luther King heroic in a lot of our eyes, because this is what we've been taught in our schools.
Hey, Rashad, before you chime back in, just very quickly, like Chad, he mentioned Stanley Levison, and I would encourage people to look into Stanley Levison. He was, part of the legal counsel for the Rosenbergs, the infamous Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. He was actually introduced to MLK in 1956 by Bayard Rustin, who joined the Young Communist League sometime during the 1930s. And so, again, it's this tangled web they weave. And he brought up Schnick. Of course, Schnick is seen as the student wing of the SELC, and then Schnick pretty much wouldn't have gotten off the ground, quite frankly, without the help or the vision or the foresight of Ella Baker. And behind Ella Baker was, of course, none other than Howard Zinn, another member of the Communist Party. Again, he denies this, but this was disclosed to the FBI that Zinn was, in fact, a member of the Communist Party. He would attend all of these conferences and concerts of Paul Robeson and so on and so forth. And so Howard Zinn was actually the mastermind. Ella Baker was the face, but Howard Zinn was the mastermind for the formulation of the of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Howard Zinn was the mastermind behind the creation of that organization. And Stanley Levison was he was subpoenaed to testify before the Senate Subcommittee on Internal Affairs in 1962. And last time I checked, I believe to this day, much of his Senate testimony is still classified. So those are the people behind the so-called civil rights movement.
Right.
Okay. I remember watching a video by Art Thompson, who's the CEO of the John Birch Society, and he was talking about the civil rights era. And he said some of the tactics that were being used was, he gave an example of a woman dressed as a nun and a guy dressed as a priest, and they'd be sitting on the court steps or standing on court steps, and then they would start performing a lewd act for the purpose of attracting law enforcement. So they would start performing this lewd act, and then all of a sudden, the cops would come over and break them up, and say, "Hey, what are you guys doing? This is, you're in public." And so you would see the cop fighting with the nun and the priest, and then all of a sudden, the cameras would start rolling, and then the headlines read, "Cops beating priests and nuns,"
Right.
So that was the first time I heard something like that. So when you're talking about these events being staged, it brought that back to memory. So some people...
But the thing about it, Rashad, not to cut you off, the thing about it is, like, even saying what you just said, like, people think that that's unfathomable, that it's inconceivable that people will go to those depths in order to influence public opinion. People don't think that they are capable of being fooled. They think that what they see on TV is truth, is gospel, is fact. Same thing with the whole George Floyd thing. Like, like, we all saw what happened in 2020 when that 8-minute, 46-second clip was released into the social media ether. It caused a reverberation around the world. Protests, looting, rioting, corporations hiring starting completely new DEI departments and government legislation and things of this nature, all based on that clip. And then by the time the truth was, could put his shoes on, where we learned that, based on the autopsy, it wasn't Derek Chauvin who actually killed George Floyd. When we learned the truths of the whole situation, it was only the damage was already done. So again, people don't think that they're capable of being fooled. When it comes to the church bombings in the middle part of the 20th century, where for most of them, they still haven't found the arsons. And in fact, as it turns out, in some of those cases, it was actual black pastors who were setting fire to their own churches and then blaming it on the Klan. When it comes to the fact that the Klan that the Klan was also influenced by communists in some cases, not all, but in some. When it comes to time and again, all of these kind of subversive tactics, people think that, oh, well, that's just hogwash. I know what I saw. I know what I learned in school. I know about the dogs and the hoses and the things of this nature. It's for this reason that they think that the civil rights movement was necessary, while the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was necessary, and while we must continue to hold people like Martin Luther King in such high esteem.
Some people, like elders, might be hearing this. My grandfather, he grew up during that time. So anytime we have a discussion about these things, he always says, his response is always, I was there. I saw it all. So what do you say to people that say, well, Chad, what do you mean this was theatrics? You know, dogs were being sicked on black people and we were suffering at this time. What do you mean that this was just a show so that Martin Luther King could step in? Didn't we need Martin Luther King? Didn't we need some civil rights because we couldn't use water fountains and go into this restaurant, this and that? Didn't we need a MLK? I was there. How do you respond to that?
Jay, you want to address?
I know Chuck wanted to say something, but I would just ask your grandfather. I would just ask your grandfather, as I have other people who are baby boomers and would have been born around this time, is what have you personally experienced in the past that was so egregious and so racist that it traumatized you to the extent that you felt like we needed a civil rights movement? I would simply ask that question, because I would venture to say that his own anecdotal personal experiences are at odds with what he would have been seeing on the black and white television at that time. I would venture to say that. Could be wrong, but I would be willing to put money on it. Go ahead, Chuck.
No, I think I don't know if well, I guess I'm introducing it now, and I don't want to take us in a different direction if Rashad doesn't want to go here. But I just think that we'd miss out on a huge opportunity to really, really get into exactly what we mean by this term civil rights. Of course, the tactics and the players and the events and all that stuff and the people that were involved, and MLK being like the centerpiece of this whole thing. But I think it is important, for us to really unpack this whole idea and this whole concept of civil rights. We keep using it over and over again, and I think that we aren't doing ourselves any favors as people when we because one person, when they mention civil rights, they can mean one thing, and then someone else, can use the exact same term and they can mean something entirely different. And so, people are kind of talking past one another. I think we really need to unpack exactly what this whole concept of civil rights. I mean, what does it actually mean? I mean, when people think about civil rights, they think about, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But of course, 100 years prior, you have the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now, the whole term civil, of course, it originates with the Roman term Cephas. And Cephas loosely translates in English as city, or one who is a city dweller. In the political centers in Greece at the time were called, the Greek city states. This kind of, decentralized kind of concept of, a small kind of group of property owning individuals who had a say so in how their laws were created, how they were, enacted, and how these laws were carried out. And so when you think about these terms like civil rights, again, we're building on this long-standing Western tradition of philosophical development in terms of what it actually means to be a quote unquote citizen. This is where we get the whole term Cephas, civic, citizen, civilization. all of these terms stem from the Greco-Roman term, word, concept of the city dweller, because this whole notion of a citizen was this thing that was unique to the West. And so when you fast forward all the way to the late 19th century, what you're talking about when you're talking about civil rights you're talking about the rights of the citizen. Now, after, the Civil War, right, everything, folks were trying to figure out, politicians, etc., how do we integrate, right, newly freed slaves into the general population now that they are free? What rights should they have as citizens, or they should have the rights of any other citizen? And so the whole point, and I'll try to make it brief, because again, you're talking about a lot of history, you're unpacking a lot of different ideas and things of that nature. But of course, by 1866, Abraham Lincoln's his Democrat vice president, Andrew Johnson, had he had assumed the role of commander in chief because of Lincoln's assassination. And in 1866, the Republican dominated Congress introduced the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that President Johnson eventually vetoed, because again, this particular piece of legislation was meant to supplement the 13th Amendment, because the attitude of the Republican Party at the time was that what good is the 13th Amendment if these oppressed blacks cannot avail themselves of their benefits? And so we need more kind of statutory legitimacy in order to make the 13th Amendment work, to make it a thing. And President Johnson vetoed it. Again, if you all are familiar with the history, he was eventually impeached for his unwillingness to go along with the Republican agenda, quite frankly. And again, you mentioned the John Birch Society. I learned a ton from the John Birch Society in terms of how much of the, quite frankly, if we're being honest with one another, we aren't, being total partisans. The Republican Party was really a party run amok during that time.
Right.
And Andrew Johnson, he vetoed the bill. But the key thing here is that, President John, I'm smiling thinking about it, because President Johnson vetoed the bill under with the understanding that the market, he said, would take care of it. And it's very interesting when you consider the fact that, again, this is the 1860s, and Andrew Johnson said, no, pretty much let the market take care of it. Let the people sort themselves out as they see fit. We mustn't, allow the federal government to involve itself in matters that are constitutionally non-permissible.
Right.
Outside the framework, outside the purview of the federal government. And of course, he was eventually, his veto, Congress overrode his veto, and then they went for, took the Article 5 route and eventually amended the Constitution once again to add the 14th Amendment. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was the sort of predecessor to the 14th Amendment, which was the predecessor to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or even to go back even further to the 1950s, which again, people look at that particular legislation, but from a judiciary from a judiciary point of view, some say the civil rights era sort of began with the Brown v. Board of Education decision of 1954, which again, we champion that. You're like, oh man, that's great. That's phenomenal. That's wonderful. But again, you had another example of judicial activism with the Brown v. Board of Education decision, because even at the time, and of course, they harken back to the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, but nowhere did the original authors of the 14th Amendment intend for the states not to have the legal right to segregate their schools. Again, before we ask ourselves, is something moral or is something more socially desirable? When you're talking about maintaining our republic, we must first ask ourselves, not is it desirable, but is it constitutionally permissible? And the reality is that the intent of the 14th Amendment was not to allow the federal government to control the educational system of the states, particularly when you consider the fact that the states that voted to ratify the 14th Amendment were practicing school segregation at the time. Okay, the federal government has no business in the business of educating or, of education. And so I'm saying in a long-winded way, right, again, and this is part of the whole, when we're talking about deception and how MLK and the rest of them, deceive the people and have actually taken more of our rights away. Again, the rights of the states to control and govern their schools as they see fit is a right that is guaranteed to them by way of the 10th Amendment. Okay. And so civil rights, quite frankly, are simply so-called rights that any given person at any given time deems politically or socially desirable. Right. But they really have no basis, if you will, in the superior principle of natural rights, which, of course, natural rights were created by God and quote unquote civil rights are created by man. And I worded that very, very strategically. And and there's no word in that sentence that I just said there is superficial, because notice I said, God, he created, right? He's the author of natural rights, but man is the author of civil rights. In that natural rights are just this stagnant, concrete thing. It's this internal truth from which we draw in order to solve modern day problems. We look to the past to solve the problems that we are confronted with today. But civil rights are created by man in that man continues to evolve and expound upon what he believes are these so-called civil rights. But these civil rights, unfortunately, run afoul to the superior kind of rights that were created by God once and for all, that we refer to as natural rights. Civil rights are a bastardization of natural rights.
Okay. So when most people hear civil rights, the term civil rights, like, the baby boomers and such, they're thinking, hey, I'm a black man, black woman. I just want to be able to go to this water fountain. I just want to be able to learn in this school or go to this restaurant.
Not a right.
Okay.
That's not a right. Because again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, Rashani. You're playing devil's advocate because you're saying, what if they ask? But see, what people fail to realize is that inherent within the definition of the word right. See, what is a right to you becomes someone else's obligation. And so therein lies the question, right? Where do your rights end and my rights begin? Okay. Well,
and that's, I'm sorry, go ahead, Chuck.
Go ahead, Chuck. I'll let you take it, Chad. I feel like I've been talking too long. I think you want to.
No.
Well, I was going to ask.
Absolutely right. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Before you chimed in, I was going to ask, so what rights did blacks not have that Martin Luther King was trying to restore? Because some people are saying that we needed civil rights to be incorporated into American society. So what rights did blacks, or were they stripped of before the Civil Rights Act? Like, were we couldn't do anything?
Well, that question is difficult to answer without acknowledging everything that Chuck just laid out.
Yeah.
Namely that, where does your another person's rights end and where does yours begin? And the fact of the matter is, when asked, what couldn't you do as a child that white people could do? Martin Luther King's answer was that I couldn't go to a store and buy a hamburger or a cup of coffee, to some of the stores that were whites only. And so the fact that leads me to ask the question of, if I am a white storekeeper and I put my own money up and I started this business, this, that, and the third, do I not have the right to determine who I can and can't hire, who I will and will not serve? That's I think something that should be left to the free market. And I make this point all the time that, we should be able to conduct our small businesses in a way that we see fit, unabated or unintruded by the federal government. What a lot of these so-called Jim Crow laws was either a county or state intrusion into how businesses are ran, who they can and can't serve, what doors blacks or whites can and can't go through, where a white or black person can and can't sit in a theater, this, that, and the third. To me, I think that is also unconstitutional for a state government to dictate these kind of things within the free market. And so the way that it was gone about, in my opinion, was all wrong.
Right.
You get into, at some point, taxation. And if the plurality of a given local community decide that, okay, this percentage of our property taxes or whatever is going to the schools, and the school board or school administrators say, okay, well, we are going to have whites only schools that get a higher percentage of the tax dollars than these black schools, that becomes an issue for that local community to resolve. And so that you kind of get into some thick weeds in trying to determine the constitutionality of the way these funds are allocated, this, that, and the third. But these issues were already being resolved well before the civil rights movement, well before Martin Luther King and everyone came onto the scene. These things were working themselves out because people were growing familiar with each other, as Booker T. Washington predicted, to the extent that you put your best foot forward, you work on yourself and work on your own culture, everybody else will see it, and these walls of prejudice will begin to break down. This is exactly what was happening. However, when you factor in the communist tactics, these Marxist tactics of agitation and propaganda, what these do is they create more friction. As Julia Brown said, they reopen old wounds. And to the extent that you have friction, people will want to distance themselves from you, not join together with you. And so when you have friction on the one hand, which intensifies, race relations, or the negativity of race relations. And on the other hand, you have this mass push for federal regulation, federal legislation to do something about it, for the federal government to compel people to act a certain way or to do a certain thing. That only makes the agitation and that only makes the frustrations all the more strong. And a lot of people realize this. This is the reason why Bob Woodson left the civil rights movement. He says that they were interested in federal, federal integration. Mm-hmm. He said, I wasn't interested in federal integration. I was interested in desegregation. I was interested in the states not having the right from a legislative point of view to dictate and mandate who these businesses can and can't serve. If the business on the ground level wants to discriminate, that should be their right. But for the state to compel people to discriminate, or for the federal government to come in and to say and to basically shove the state out of the way, and then they impose or compel the private business to act a certain way, both are unconstitutional. Okay. And I know that doesn't directly answer your question as to what rights did blacks and whites not have, but I at the same time, in a way, I don't think that's the right question, because and you can tell me if you don't, if I'm confusing the matter, but to me, it doesn't acknowledge the fact that when it comes to on the ground level, how we interact with each other, the government shouldn't have a say in it one way or the other, unless I'm stealing your property, I'm threatening your life or strangling you, whatever the case may be. The government shouldn't have a say in how I treat you, or how I speak to you, or whether I do or don't serve you. If that makes sense.
Okay.
Because
I got a few more points I want to touch on just for the sake of time. But yeah, I mean, when you look at, I guess some of the gender or, the rainbow push, right, and you incorporate the Civil Rights Act into that whole agenda, now it's like people are saying, well, if you have a church, you can't discriminate according to the Civil Rights Act. If if a guy wants to preach in your church and he has a dress and some lipstick on, you can't discriminate against him, So
Right.
people, I keep hearing this. People have said that Martin Luther King was a Republican, his father was a Republican, and I can never find evidence of that. That's one. And secondly, another thing that surprised me was I found out that MLK got an award from Planned Parenthood. Could you guys touch on that a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, he did. He did receive the inaugural. Why am I forgetting the woman's name?
Margaret Sanger.
Yeah, the inaugural Margaret Sanger award. He wasn't present to receive it. His wife received it in his place. And, you can go online and actually read the speech she gave when she accepted the award on his behalf. But yeah, and again, it reminds me when you bring that up, just the whole link between the two. Margaret Sanger, of course, she was another fellow traveler. Again, whether these people call themselves communist or not, communism, fascism, all of these different isms, they all fall under the umbrella of this statist ideology, and they all, refer to themselves as progressives. And, Margaret Sanger being a progressive, she too made her sojourn to the Soviet Union. And, she encouraged and gave the Soviets the blueprint on different types of, family planning, quote unquote, strategies. And what she said is that, pretty much kind of like the same sentiment you hear from the left today, which is that to kill a child in the womb is almost like an act of mercy. Because why bring a child into a world filled with so much injustice, particularly economic injustice? And this was Margaret Sanger's attitude at the time in the 1920s, that, when it came to the Soviet Union, she said that the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was the first country on record to legalize abortion. And over a 10-year span, it went so poorly that they reversed course immediately. Anyway, that's a whole nother story. But she would say that this is what the Soviet Union must do. And I'm paraphrasing her, until they have pretty much amassed enough power and, perfected the society through government planning in such a way that there would be no need for abortions, because everyone would be more than willing to have a child, because the state would be well equipped or equipped enough to handle the burden of providing for however many children that the Soviet people wanted to have. And so until the government has the requisite powers necessary to provide adequate, and now that has just broadened, right? We're talking adequate housing. They need adequate medicine. Everyone needs adequate food. Everything is a right. And until we get that in order, then abortion it has to be, because, we can only, we as a society, we can only take on so much.
Yeah.
So when you said that, I'm like you, Rashad. I've never found evidence to suggest that MLK was a Republican. But when it's all said and done, when you think about it, particularly during that era with the Republican Party, it pretty much wouldn't have mattered much, because sort of like now, it was true back then. And again, there are these brief respites, when it comes to the Republican Party, at least on a national scale, where they tend to be, and you'll see this embodied, of course, in particular presidents, or even in certain senators and so on. But the overall attitude of the Republican Party during this time in the 1950s was almost indistinguishable from the attitudes of the Democrat Party. And this goes all the way back to how the FDR era had really done a number, not just on society, but on our political system as well, where the Republican Party took up this attitude that, well, if you can't beat them, join them. But what we need to do is that, as opposed to what the Democrats are doing, we're going to use the federal purse and we're going to use federal power to implement a quote unquote conservative agenda. Now, of course, you can see how going contradictory that is, because the entire premise of conservatism as an ideology should not be to implement more laws to pursue a conservative agenda. You must repeal laws in order to pursue a conservative agenda, because conservatism, in my humble opinion, is should be more, about, of course, the citizenry. But I'm just a couple more points and I'm going. At the time in the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower, and this is a famous quote of his, that when it comes to economic issues, I am conservative, but when it comes to human issues, I am a liberal, unquote. Even Vice President Richard Nixon under Dwight Eisenhower at the time would say similar things, that we need to pursue, sort of like what George Herbert Walker Bush did after Reagan's second term, is, we need to, one of his campaign slogan was a kinder, gentler America, because we need to move away from the harshness and the wild cowboy era that was Ronald Reagan. You had the exact same thing in the 1950s with the Republican Party. Again, this was the attitude of Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon. And lastly, there were two books, and it was common at the time, even for Republicans, to refer to themselves as progressives. We were progressive Republicans. This is what they were calling themselves in the 1950s. And you had certain elements of Republicans that were fighting against it. You had Senator Robert Taft, you had Barry Goldwater, you had some others. But in 1955, in response to this kind of executive dominance on the national scale during the 1950s, after Harry Truman, a man by the name of Dean Acheson, who served as the Secretary of State under Harry Truman, published or released a book called A Democrat Speaks to His Party. That was 1955. In the following year, in response to that book, a Republican, I think, who served as under Secretary of State for Dwight Eisenhower, released a book titled A Republican Speaks to His Party. This was 1956. If you line both those books up and you read them or sift through them, again, they're almost indistinguishable from one another.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
And this was the 1950s.
Wow.
They were both, Republicans and Democrats were both kind of pursuing this progressive agenda simultaneously.
Right. So there was the neocons. Go ahead. Neocons back then. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Well, we'll see. Rashad, the thing about it is, the people who would be considered neocons during that period, I guess they were kind of like the neocons, but then the neocons to Trump, the 50s neocons, was this new kind of Goldwater Reagan-esque era of Republicans that were, considered to be the neocons, if you will, of the 1970s, that were trying to pull, I guess, the Republican Party away from the center and I guess more to the right. So, yeah, anyway.
In regards to the abortion issue, I remember reading Margaret Sanger. I'm paraphrasing what she said, but she made a quote saying, if blacks or Negroes ever get suspicious about, I guess, our agenda, abortion and Planned Parenthood, it's the Negro minister who would be the right person to straighten them out. So when Coretta Scott King accepted this award, I mean, were the Kings, were they pro-abortion?
Well, the thing is, they didn't speak out against abortion. And by virtue of them, I mean, and again, they weren't ignorant to what Margaret Sanger was all about. They weren't ignorant to what Planned Parenthood was all about. And so, the fact of the matter is, one can't justifiably argue that Martin Luther King himself was against abortion by virtue of the fact that he accepted this award, knowing full well what Margaret Sanger was all about. That would have been a perfect opportunity for he or Coretta Scott to say, look, we appreciate the award, but at the same time, we must make it known that we are against the annihilation of Black babies in the womb. But they didn't. They lauded Margaret Sanger for the great work that she's done and this, that, and the third. I mean, again, like Chuck said, people can go and read the acceptance speech of this award. And I think that tells people everything they need to know. But everything, that Chuck said is absolutely right. When you look at Robert La Follette, who was a senator in the early part of the 20th century, he was a Republican, and he, for all intents and purposes, can be considered the Bernie Sanders of his day, insofar that he was very socialist in his political philosophy. Again, all throughout the 20th century, there was very little distinguishable difference between Republicans and Democrats. For crying out loud, when you look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, without the support of the Republicans, you wouldn't have your Civil Rights Act of 1964. A lot of what has gone on over the course of the 20th century, as far as America moving more and more closer to a socialist country, has been done by Democrats and Republicans. And the reason for this is because we are at a point, we have been at a point for a very long time, where a person being a Republican or Democrat is not based in any kind of principled philosophy or understanding of what kind of government and what kind of country should we have. A person's political affiliation has more to do with what they can get out of being a Republican or a Democrat at a given time, or their dislike or disdain for the quote unquote other side. Has nothing to do with principle, has nothing to do with understanding that, well, to the extent that we give the government this much power, we are losing our freedoms. Has nothing to do with that, one way or the other. And so whether Martin Luther King was a Republican or not, to me, doesn't matter when I know the history of the Republican Party. As Chuck said, eloquently earlier, about how the Republican Party, even in the days of Abraham Lincoln, was run amok. It just simply was. And we have now this kind of debate as a result of what Nikki Haley said recently about slavery and whether or not slavery was the center point of the civil rights, or not the civil rights, but the Civil War. Even it was complex even back then. You had some who were part of the Civil War in the South, part of the Confederacy, who didn't really care about slavery. Their dog in the fight was for states' rights. They genuinely just wanted states' rights. And you had others who were part of the Confederacy who wanted to prolong slavery. So it just it was a matter of who you were asking. And so again, we try to fit everything into a perfect little box where it just, this is the explanation. There's no other explanation. And we just let that be that. Yeah. But one thing that I will say is, when it comes to a person today in 2024 who calls himself a Republican or a conservative, they have to ask themselves, why? Why are you a Republican or a conservative? What is the basis of your conservatism? Are you social? Is it social issues? Is it economic issues? Do you genuinely believe in the philosophy of the republic as a result, opposed to a monarchy or a democracy, whatever the case may be? Like, what is the basis of your conservatism or of your being a Republican? Most people can't answer that question, unfortunately. But if you genuinely believe that you are a conservative, if you genuinely believe that you are someone who wishes to have a federal government that is very limited in its powers, who wishes to crack down on the bureaucracy, who wishes to maintain the sovereignty and the power of the local government, which gets its dictates from the people within that local context. If that's genuinely something that you want, then you must reconsider who you call your heroes, because Martin Luther King is antithetical to that idea. And I tell people all the time, when it comes to this battle of Republicans and Democrats claiming Martin Luther King as their own, it is like a tug of war. And I tell you, if you are a conservative, let go of the rope and resolve to make other people your philosophical heroes or whatever the case may be. But you'll find fault even in those people, which leads me to say, you should get your principles from the Bible, from the gospel.
Right.
That should dictate how you see the world and the complexities of the world, because truth be told, the world is a very complex place. It just is. And to try to fit everything into a neat little packaged Republican versus Democrat, left versus right, I think to that end, we'll continue to wander around in this web of confusion.
Yeah.
Can I chime in before you jump in, Rashad?
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know about you guys. I'm not really on a tight schedule. I know your shows don't run too long, but I don't feel the need to rush through because I'm here for hours if you need me. But anyway, like Chad said, when people say that our society is founded upon biblical principles and this and that, just think about it in the most broad, I guess, philosophical sense possible, because our entire small R Republican system of checks and balances is, of course, predicated upon the revealed truth of the Bible, which is that man, we are fallen beings, and so you have to have a system of checks and balances in place in order to protect man from the wicked impulses inherent in all men. And the problem, just to go back, because I wanted to say something earlier when we were talking about, what were we supposed to do? Blacks were suffering, this was happening, and that was happening. And again, it goes back to this idea of, once again, states' rights and local government rights. Because considering the power and the influence of federal government, of course, you do not concentrate power at the point of the federal government, because of those negative impulses inherent within all men can corrupt the entire society from the top down. You must, of course, diffuse power horizontally and then vertically integrate it. When Chad talks about states' rights, just as an aside, and I don't want to unpack the Civil War, but Abraham Lincoln, even when he was campaigning leading up to 1860, he vowed that there would not be a war. And then depending upon, whose historical perspective you pay attention to, it was, in fact, Abraham Lincoln who instigated the South into the attack at Fort, I think Sumter is what it was. Mm-hmm. But anyway, not to unpack that. But even when it comes to slavery and when it comes to the issue of the civil rights movement, this is what I really want to get at, is that these unjust laws were again, they were falling off the books. You see, it's one thing to say, well, we don't like the way blacks are being treated. OK, I get it. But once again, the better question becomes, what is the proper way to go about fixing these perceived issues? Again, the 10th Amendment reads clearly. It says that, any power not delegated to the federal government by the United States Constitution or prohibited by the states is reserved for the states respectively. If you want to get Jim Crow off the books, you make an appeal to your local and state government. The federal government has no say-so in the matter. So again, it goes back to our understanding of history or lack thereof, because a lot of people, quite frankly, do not know what was going on prior to the 1960s. We take that little flashpoint in time, if you want to, start with the 1955 bus boycott, and fast forward the Selma March and all that stuff in 65. In the minds of so many people, that was the entire history of America from the end of the Civil War up to that point. And the reality is that is not true, because a lot of the racial strife and, quite frankly, and I hate to use the term economic inequality, but anyway, but a lot of the economic inequality in these things, they were, it was correcting itself. It was correcting itself due to the systemic, informal, but personal mechanisms like Andrew Johnson harped on back then in the 1860s, thanks to the free market. The free market was fixing the problems. And then once blacks and whites were becoming ever more familiar with one another through working together to fulfill a mutually beneficial task, even if that task is being pursued for selfish reasons, once you begin to have a healthy reliance upon someone else for your own provisions, well, then that is how respect is gained. And as respect eventually becomes friendship, friendship eventually becomes love and acceptance, and so on and so forth. And then when society reaches a certain point, then you make an appeal to your legislatures,
Right.
so that if need be, they can implement laws that are in kind or in keeping with the moral compass or zeitgeist at the time of the society. But what happened with the civil rights movement is that we leapfrogged everything, got the entire process out of order, and to society's detriment, unfortunately, for many reasons.
Yeah. I've always said, like, you can't have a viable society if it's a truly racist society. It won't be a viable one, because people, at the end of the day, the average human being wants to make an income. They want to live comfortable. That's a lot of people's main concern. So if people are genuinely to the core racist, I mean, it would make life so difficult for you to say, hey, I don't want to do business with the black man. I'm just going to do business with this person. Then you're cutting into your income. So on a practical level, it just doesn't make sense.
Right. Like a savings and loan company or a bank, you know what I mean? Like, they do themselves any favors by refusing to extend credit to credit worthy black applicants. It doesn't work that way. It hasn't worked. It doesn't work that way now. And it has never worked that way.
Yeah. Cause I always look at it like, I mean, why do people think that others are so concerned? Like, when I hear some black people talk, it's like, nobody is thinking about you that much. Like, nobody is sitting around thinking like, I have to hold the black man down because I just, their melanin really concerns me, and I just, I gotta do something,
Hey, people believe that, though. People really believe that.
No, I know.
There's black folks that believe that about white folks, is what I mean to say.
Right. Yeah, it's like nobody's really thinking about that. The average person is just trying to get by in their daily life. It's not that serious. A few more things. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, bro. You got a question? Yeah. I wanted to address one thing, but if you got a question, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna move on to some issues about people saying that Martin Luther King was a plagiarist, and I was gonna also touch on some personal activities I was reading from an FBI file about the whole infidelity issue. But what do you guys? What's your take on the whole plagiarism issue?
Go ahead, Chad.
I'll try to make my statement brief. But yeah, he was absolutely a plagiarist. I mean, his whole dissertation that he wrote to even become a doctorate recipient was plagiarized. And not only that, it's interesting whenever I'm sharing the information that I shared with you, not only on this podcast, but on the last time that you had me on. When I share that information with people, ever so often I'll get the comment from an academic or a scholar who says, well, Chad, you're wrong. Martin Luther King didn't have a proclivity to or a liking of communism because he said so himself. And they'll proceed to quote a chapter from a book called Where Do We Go From Here? I think that was the one, if I'm not mistaken. But in it, he talks about communism and how he can't be a communist because he's a Christian, and communism is antithetical to Christianity, this, that, and the third. But if you read that chapter, you'll find that it even is plagiarized from a piece written by one Robert J. McCracken. And so my question to the person who pushes back against me is to say, if Martin Luther King was genuinely anti-communist, then why would he use someone else's words and try to pass them as his own to distance himself from communism? If you genuinely was anti-communist, wouldn't you say so in your own words with passion, with vigor? Why would you have to plagiarize somebody else and use what they said as your thing and not credit that person You know what I mean? It will be one thing if, he borrowed some word from McCracken and said, this is what McCracken said, and I agree. Like, no, you plagiarized this man and tried to pretend that these words were your own. To me, that's a very lazy way of distancing yourself from communist ideology. It's just as if he, like, you know what, he said something. Okay, let me put that in here. And this is my take on communism. And the fact of the matter is, everything else that he did and said demonstrates that he was, in fact, partial to communist ideology. Doesn't matter what you said in that book. What matters to me is everything else that you're doing with your legs and saying with your mouth. And so a lot of the speeches that he gave were written not by him, but by Clarence B. Jones, who had some loose connections with communist organizations. Was written by Stanley Levison, who was the treasurer for a communist front group in New York and also had ties to the Communist Party. And Bayard Rustin, who was a part of the Communist Youth League as a youngster and never really left communist efforts in his career, in his long career. And so if you're getting all of your information from people who are communists, if you are plagiarizing other folks so as to make yourself look like something else, that goes back into the deception piece earlier that you were asking about. All that to say that Martin Luther King was a concoction. He wasn't genuine. He wasn't someone who is a person of integrity that deserves the kind of enshrinement and praise that we lavish him with to this very day, where, this coming Monday, you'll have a lot of people who are celebrating him, who are worshiping him. You'll have a lot of news reporters who are saying, today we commemorate a great man who was the moral leader of the 20th century. He wouldn't be enjoying all of this without the deception that he was part of, which included plagiarism, the large body of plagiarism that he used. So,
a
few more things before. Go ahead, Chuck.
No, I was going to say I don't really have much more to add to that. It's funny when people still deny it, even mainstream. The mainstream, popular convention acknowledges this. Of course, they excuse him for it, just the same way they excuse away his extramarital activity. But yes, Dr. King's plagiarism is something that is even remotely controversial. Even again, if you go to, mainstream academic sources, just the whole wider institution of, higher academia and the intelligentsia, they acknowledge even to this day that Dr. King did, play fast and loose with his citations and things of that nature. And yes, he was in fact a plagiarist. And just to also piggyback just on what I almost called you Blanche, Chad, but Chad said, just about, this denial. Well, how do you know? And how, this and that. I mean, and Chad is right. I mean, how does someone who claims to be this, I'm so anti-communist, but yet, everywhere you look, you're surrounded by this one and that one. I mean, someone who considers themselves to be a Christian, again, why would you, gallivant around with the likes of men like Stokely Carmichael if you're such this Christian?
Right.
Why in the world would, someone who's, known communist ties like a Stanley Levison, someone in the Bible, even another one of Dr. King's close personal aides who helped organize and fundraise for the March on Washington was another communist, a black man by the name of Jack Odell. Mm-hmm. Again, everywhere you look, there's a communist here, there's a communist there, there's a communist everywhere, like a Dr. Seuss rhyme, and so, but, Doctor, he's the only one. He's just standing there again and in his rhetoric and what he was pushing for and what he was pursuing, again, this whole redistributive justice, this economic justice and these various things, these lofty, wild, nebulous terms one of the key pieces of legislation we don't talk about enough when we talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a bill that was passed into law and signed by Lyndon B. Johnson in that same year. I believe the month was August of 1964, called the Economic Opportunity Act. Right. Again, this was all part of this whole progressive, this whole, reinforcement, if you will, of all of FDR's, New Deal ideas in the 1960s. And again, I even hear Republicans even nowadays talk about how far we've gone, how far the Overton window has moved to the left, that someone like a JFK would be a Republican today. Let me just say this. And you talked about, you brought up the whole Democrat-Republican thing. Just full disclosure, I vote Republican. And the reason why I do so is simple. It's not complicated at all. It's quite simple. I don't know if I should be ashamed to say this, but it reminds me of something that the great Dr. Thomas Sowell says when he asks the question, one of his essays, he poses the question to himself and answers. He says that I ask myself, as a country, are we headed toward collapse? Are we headed towards oblivion in the United States? And he says, my answer, unfortunately, is yes. He says, but the only good news is it hasn't happened yet. And the way things work are that nothing is inevitable until it is. So unfortunately, the key selling point of the Republican Party as of right now is the fact that they're simply going in the exact same direction as the left. They're just going slower. So unfortunately, when we vote Republican, we're simply just buying ourselves a little bit more time. And I'm not saying that that's not the smart thing to do. If you ask me, if you say, you bang the guy, will give you the death penalty. You want to go usher you out to the gallows now and hang you, or you want to hang around for a couple more years? I think I want to hang around for a little while, But
you have no illusions about the Republican.
But I have no illusions about what
savior of the Republic.
Yeah, I got you.
What's going on?
Yeah, it's the
anyway.
Lesser of two evils argument. I mean, I've always countered that with voting for some third party candidates because, people, I get into these discussions often, and people, when I tell them that I'm voting for this candidate who's a third party candidate, like let's say maybe someone with the Constitution Party who lines up with all of my values, and people say, oh, that you're wasting your vote. And then I say, well, no, I'm not. I ask, why do you say that? And they say, oh, because nobody's going to vote for them. They're not going to win. Well, how do you win? Oh, you got to vote for them. So why don't you vote for them? You see? So if we support them, they can actually win, but nobody wants to support them. So
ultimately, Rashad, I'm sorry to cut you off, but ultimately the problem isn't so much the politicians. We've allowed this to occur, the citizens. And because there's been a ceaseless assault, on our minds and on our spirits, quite frankly. And, the people with the wherewithal to go to government at whatever level, right, and say that, I'm going to restore freedom, right, give it back to the people, shut down the bureaucracy, right? We're going to bust up the teachers unions. We're going to, do this and do that. We aren't going to implement laws to quote unquote fix things. We're going to repeal laws so that you can fix them on your own. And whatever else, people with the wherewithal and the requisite integrity to do such a thing, to go to government so as not to claim more power for themselves, but to really, really return that power back to the people. Those individuals wouldn't dare run for office. And the reason being because it goes back to the old cliche of when the teacher or when the student is ready, the master will appear. No one is willing to put themselves up for that kind of, thing when they pretty much know that the people aren't going to vote for me because they're not in line with the way I think. So why waste my time?
Yeah.
Who in the heck is going to vote? I go back to something Thomas Sowell said again. He said that no politician has ever been elected by telling the people no.
Yeah.
And why in the heck would I run? I said, I'm not, what are you going to do to fix the economy? Well, it's not my job to fix the economy. That's your job. Are you going to get up off your lazy behind and interact with people? Are you going to do something?
Yeah.
I don't know what So who's going to vote for that guy?
Yeah. It boils down to.
So that guy doesn't run. That guy stays at home.
Right. Yeah. I think, I don't know if it was Thomas Jefferson. I don't know if he said this, but he said you've never had a society that or a people that were ignorant and free at the same time.
That's right. That's right. Do you remember the question you were going to ask, Rashad?
Yeah, I was actually, before we wrap up, I was actually going to talk about, I don't want to get too scandalous, but I'm just bringing this up because, you know, we're taught that MLK was a Christian pastor, and this is the image we're presented. But there was an FBI file that was released in, I think, 2017, 2018. I think Trump declassified these JFK files. A lot of people were upset with him because he didn't release the full thing, but the portions that did come out had some information about King, and the file that I'm reading from, it's a Federal Bureau of Investigation, subject Martin Luther King Jr., a current analysis, date March 12th, 1968. And on, I think it was page 19, it talks about King's personal conduct. I'll just read a quick portion of it. It says, with the funds that he had received from the Ford Foundation, they have a lot of questionable activity. King,
absolutely.
Yeah, King held the first of 2 workshops in Miami, Florida, in February 1968 to train Negro ministers in urban leadership. One Negro minister in attendance later expressed his disgust with the behind-the-scenes drinking, fornication, and homosexuality that went on at the conference. Several Negro and white prostitutes were brought in from the Miami area. An all-night sex orgy was held with these prostitutes and some of the delegates in attendance. One room had a large table in it, which was filled with whiskey. 2 Negro prostitutes were paid $50 to put on a sex show for entertainment of the guest. A variety of sex acts, blah, 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 blah. And it goes into some previous sexual activities. And there's a book that I got a few years ago called Marxianity by Brandon House. I don't know if you guys heard of this.
Yeah.
And he talks about that. Yeah, he talks about that as well. There's a portion that he wrote about King, and he says that the wiretapping triggered by King's communist associations ended up in revealing other troubling truths about King. It was revealed in 2017. The wiretappings picked up King organizing sex parties. So graphic, I wouldn't describe them here, but he says that Jackie Kennedy was so revolted by what she learned of King's behavior through the wiretappings that she could hardly look at King without disgust. So
that's rich coming from her, but considering we'll go ahead.
Yeah. So, you know, again, everybody has flaws, you know, everybody has a past, but, you know, when I read that, it's just, it transforms or just demolishes my whole perception, or it did when I read it. And so I'm wondering, Monday, we have this holiday. How is it that we've gone so long, or some people may be asking or watching this and saying, how have we been propagandized so strongly? How could the deception be this strong and continue to be this strong? Because if you talk to somebody on the street, the average person on the street, they know nothing about this. How is the propaganda so strong?
Go ahead, Chad. I'm gonna go. I feel like I talked last. I can't remember if I talked last.
No, so you're asking how can a propaganda?
Well, for the average person,
so strong. Yeah, for the average person. Again, like the fact is, all of the youngsters that I know today, here in my little corner of Texas, they do believe that they do believe the deception or they do believe that we have been deceived as a country when it comes not only to the civil rights movement, but also when it comes to, you know, fill in the blank, whether it be feminism, whether it be the current kind of LGBT kind of agenda. Like, they believe that all of this stuff is possible and is in fact happening. Whereas most of the people who have gone to public schools here in America, they're a little bit more difficult of a code to crack. And that goes to, once again, as I alluded to earlier, how part of the deception is the fact that we are indoctrinated by our public education system to be susceptible to social justice movements, to have a kind of natural, innate connection with a civil rights movement or a social justice movement or whatever the case may be.
Right.
And so even to the extent that we find out or figure out the fact that these people aren't who we've been, trained to believe they are, it still doesn't resonate with us, because what we convince ourselves of is this notion that, or this idea rather, that even if these things are true, it doesn't take away from the fact that they still did good things, or it doesn't take away from the idea that, well, so what, he liked communism or Marxism. It was the only way that we could have some kind of freedom in this country for Blacks and other people of color. And so we have been conditioned in such a way that we try to find ways to justify what we already have been taught is truth, namely that people like Martin Luther King are these heroes that we must hold in high regard. Anytime there's some kind of race issue in the country, that's not even a race issue. You can't objectively say that the whole George Floyd thing had anything to do with race. You can't objectively say that Mike Brown had anything to do with race, or any of the other more recent things that have happened over, in the last 10 years. You can't say that these things have anything to do with race. But when they do happen, and you have the pundits and the news reporters who come out of the woodworks and opine, they always bring it back to Martin Luther King, because they hold him as the standard. We've been conditioned to hold him as the standard. So again, to the question of how can we be so deceived? You can be deceived if the hegemony is such to where everything is moving in one direction. And that's by design. When you look at who is behind the very existence of a Department of Education and the whole nine, when you look at the fact that these things were instituted for the very reason of centralizing and collectivizing people into a certain way of thinking, it begins to make sense how the deception can be so elaborate and so systematic to the point where public opinion is dependent on the existence of this hegemony, if that makes sense. And that's the lock and loaded answer that I have to such a question, is that everything is designed and put into place in such a way that the whole point is to keep deceptions like this alive. Now I say that while at the same time not being somebody who gets so caught up in who the man behind the curtain is that it's going to affect how I live and the amount of sleep I get at night. I still sleep fine at night, knowing that you have such sinister people who are the proverbial man behind the curtain, because at the end of the day, the onus of me is on me, as it says in the final words of Ecclesiastes, to fear God and keep his commands, for this is the whole duty of man. And so I can live a life of joy and of doing what I've been born into this world to do as a believer in Christ. I can do that even though I do live in a world where you have these kind of sociologists and these kind of social engineers and these activists and other nefarious people who are desperately trying to shape society in the way that they want to see it go. It doesn't affect my life in this way, but it is also important for me to play the prophet, so to speak, to warn people, hey, this is what's happened historically. This is what continues to happen to this very day. So they don't, lest they be deceived by new social justice movements to come, which again are meant to expand the role of the government in this kind of globalist quest for power, while at the same time usurping your rights as a free citizen in the West.
Right. Yeah, because everything Chad said is correct, of course. And I just like to, just get particular and just add another caveat, like we spoke about education earlier. There's this, what do they call it? They call it matching funds or fund, fund matching. I know matching funds is what it's called. And what it is pretty much how, the federal government has acquired the ability to pretty much blackmail the states for funding, because, you have these completely irrelevant, just useless, just dangerous, quite frankly, institutions like the Department of Education. And they sit on high, right? And they look down at the, these like Chad mentioned, the public schools. And they say, well, if you don't have a sufficient amount of this going on, or if this is not happening in your curriculum, or that's not happening in your curriculum, and so on and so forth, then, you have to curtail your curriculum to fit the agenda of the federal government, or else, you will be denied funding and this and that. And so, you have these state legislatures who will not refuse federal funding with those conditions, that they implement an educational curriculum that suits the federal government, because many of them see it as a form of political suicide. And so you can see how dangerous this is. And the reason why they see it as a form of political suicide is because the state has already collected the taxes from their own citizens or those residents in the state. They've already taxed them. And so the federal government then collects these taxes from the states, that it then collects a kind of brokerage fee or processing fee, if you will, to then redistribute the monies that they took from the states in the first place. So the states are merely getting a smaller portion of the money back that they put into this collective pot that was then, or what was decided to do with the monies that was collected from the states was the federal government. And so you have the federal government implementing, again, this statist ideology, because they want to groom society and groom citizens in such a way that they then, when they become, parenthetically speaking, functional adults, right, they lean heavily on the state for their daily bread. So teach them to become dependent upon the state. Use their tax monies to teach them how to become more dependent upon us. And that's just like one small aspect of it. Because even when you're talking about, school and education, one of the key points was these various colleges of education. And this is where the left, the neo-communist left in the 1960s and 70s, who were, many of them remained in college in order to avoid the draft, and not just because they were just cowards who were afraid of war. They pretty much stayed in college again for ideological reasons, but many of them focused in on these various colleges of education because they thought that they could influence a larger swath of the general population if many of these activists became teachers. It isn't so much that, well, you go into this one particular field, but if you go to a college of education and you educate the teachers who educate the students, then you can affect more change in that way. Propagandize the teachers who then propagandize the students. There aren't enough of us to get to the masses of people, but let's radicalize the teachers. And then you couple that with this idea of interdisciplinary, how do they say it? Interdisciplinarity, right? Which is, these folks who, again, specialize in this one particular thing, but they feel as though to get a broader understanding of that particular thing, right, they must incorporate other disciplines in order to better understand, for example, how to be a judge or how to be a lawyer. So instead of specializing in law, you take this interdisciplinarian type of or interdiscipline type pedagogy or method, so to speak. And now you are using your position as a judge to implement a certain agenda based upon your rudimentary understanding of something like psychology and sociology.
Gotcha.
That's not the goal. That's not what a judge is supposed to do. But again, many of them are using whatever their the field in which they are supposed to specialize in, and they're implementing other kinds of things and factors, again, in order to implement this
Bettina
social
Albecker, Angela Davis, Howard Zinn, all these people turned out to be educators who are teaching teachers and
teaching
these
teachers
are going out and
Right. I heard Frank Turek, he said, everybody's a disciple, or I think someone he had on the show said, everybody is a disciple. The question is, who's discipling you? Who's doing the discipling? We're all disciples. Right. But when you talked about the state earlier, it always goes back when it goes back to the state, and the state, we look to the state as being God. That at its root, in my opinion, is synonymous with Marxism. And my last.
I want to make one more point before you close out, because it looks like you're about to close out soon. There's a lot of people, who were warning against the dangers of implementing the Civil Rights Act. Those people turned out to be right, because what ended up happening was later on down the line, we really began to see that this was not allowing Blacks to move about freely in the society. It was about finding ways to give them a leg up. Even if, when it came to the Supreme Court case of Griggs versus Dupower in 1971, you also had another Supreme Court case that was even more ridiculous when you talk about judicial activism in the name of Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, was a case called U.S. Steelworkers versus Weber, where, Weber felt as though he was, denied a membership to the guild or to the union because, he was white. But the court decided that, it's funny how they want to play this game of textualism when they want to. When it came to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that the wording of the law was specifically meant to alleviate pre-existing or racial conditions that disenfranchised African Americans. So in so many words, you can be discriminated against under the statute of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, because as a white person, the law wasn't meant to apply to you. And then you can read the decision and how the highfalutin, legalese that they speak with. But what it all boils down to is that, when it comes to that, you don't have the right to discriminate against a person based on their race. It doesn't apply to a white person if, by not discriminating against a white person, it reinforces pre-existing racial inequalities that the act was meant to solve. And so it's just pretty much a law that allows for this kind of quote unquote reverse discrimination, as they like to call it.
Yeah. Teach them, Chuck. Last question. So do you think that the message that's being taught in churches across America, in terms of when you go to church, you're hearing the pastor preach the gospel. A lot of times the pastor, yes, he's supposed to preach the gospel. Some people are walking away with not necessarily getting daily application or finding out how the gospel is applied to what's going on in culture. And I'm asking this because when I talk to some people about the issues, these are church-going people, they don't know about the information that we're talking about today. And some of them are supporting causes that are, again, contrary to biblical values. So, I have friends and family that would say they're Christian. They love Jesus, but they would support Joe Biden and they don't see anything wrong with his ideology on gender. They would say, oh, well, God loves everybody. Everybody's God's child. So my question is, are the pastors in the church, is the teaching translating into people's, I guess, daily or teaching people how to look at the world? Or is it not translating in a sense? Like, so are people really walking away from the church saying, well, this is contrary to what my church is teaching me every Sunday. So why am I supporting this? Do you guys find that there's a disconnect in the church?
There's a huge disconnect. And the fact is, just yesterday, I listened to 2 Martin Luther King sermons. These were sermons that were delivered to a church congregation. And what he did in those sermons is the same as what a lot of pastors unfortunately do today. Namely, he started off with a couple of verses from the word, and then he proceeded to take a little piece of that scripture and make it mean something that had nothing to do with what the scripture was communicating, to then make a point about racist America and how there will be a reckoning for this wicked racist country. And again, there's no calling on the congregation to repent. There's no, re-emphasizing the fact that now that you are saved, now that you have acknowledged the work of Christ on the cross as being a perpetuation for your sins, you must now choose this day forward to follow Christ, to make him your Lord. It's not enough for him to be your savior. He must now be your individual Lord. There was none of that. Once again, it was, look at how this country is doing, and look at how they're fighting in Vietnam, and look at how this and look at how that. So again, the onus is on society and the country, who may or may not be Christians, more so than the congregation who have professed a faith in Christ. And so what Martin Luther King was doing, once again, is the same thing that many churches unfortunately teach today. They use this kind of spiritually tinged rhetoric so as to reinforce this notion that I am a pastor, I am a reverend, I am authoritative in this church. And people believe, because of this, that they are hearing a word from God or hearing a word of God. And they never stop to ask themselves a question: is what the pastor is saying in keeping with the scriptures? Is what the pastor is saying, is there fidelity to the scriptures? And so, because they make the central figure of their faith what the pastor is saying, more so than Christ, it's for this reason that you get a lot of things that are happening in the culture, in society, with the DNC or the RNC, and people don't have a frame of reference from which to judge, is what I'm seeing in the culture something that God would say is an abomination, or is it something that is in keeping with God's word? And so this is the reason why a lot of folks, unfortunately, who go to church every Sunday will say, well, yeah, we're supposed to love everybody. Of course, I'm supportive of LGBT because we're supposed to love everybody, because they have no idea that the fact that in the Bible, it says that, those who practice homosexuality will not inherit the kingdom of God. It says that in the scriptures, in black and white, but people, they don't have any idea of this, because even though they go to church, they don't read the scriptures for themselves. And the pastor isn't shepherding them in the way of the word. And so, because the pastor is not saying anything that is in keeping with the scriptures, the pastor is more ready and more quick to condone this dark and dying culture than to speak on how we must ourselves navigate this dark and dying culture, namely that we are following Holy Spirit, that we're following the Christ even in the midst of it. Again, people have no frame of reference. And so I do know people personally, and this is true even of myself, who, although I did grow up in a church where the pastor was more of a social justice activist than he was a man of God, although that's the context in which I grew up, it wasn't until I started reading the scriptures for myself and being challenged for what the Bible actually says that I had to make a decision as to continue to to believe and move in the direction that I've been going, or to choose to repent and choose to stay to follow Christ. I had to make that decision, and I believe I made the right decision. And I know other people who have made the right decision when confronted with the truth of what the scriptures actually say. But unfortunately, a lot of people they don't want to do the work of actually looking in the mirror of the scripture and ask themselves, am I following the decrees of what God himself said, or am I rebelling against what God says, while at the same time, falsely believing that I'm one of his remnant?
Yeah.
So
it does require work. I always say Christianity is not a lazy man's religion. That's for sure.
Right.
Fellas, this was great. I think both of you guys need to write some books. I think, man, when I hear you guys, you guys are like the thought leaders. The baton needs to be handed to you. Seriously. Your show, you want to plug any of your stuff, shows, anything?
Yeah, just, every Sunday, Chad O'Jackson's, well, I guess Chad could say this part. But no, I just have a YouTube channel. My name is Chuck Littleton. Of course, my name on my birth certificate is Charles, of course, common for people whose name Charles to be nicknamed Chuck. That's what most people call me. My friends call me. But, my YouTube channel is called Teach 'em Chuck. Another friend of mine, he, gave me that nickname, so I just ran with it. I have my own YouTube channel. I'm just trying to grow it, get my subscribers up there. I'm a little over 1,000 now. I don't have a ton because I don't post a lot of content. I post a lot of long form, 2 hour plus long, discussions or talks. I try not to call them lectures because I don't want to, think too highly of myself. But yeah, I post these long, and it takes me hours and hours and hours to prepare, notes and things of that nature. So I don't get to post much because it takes a lot of work. But yeah, I'm on a YouTube channel, Teach 'em Chuck. We'll check it out. Just recently, I did a 3-part series on Barack Obama. I just uploaded the third installment of that a few weeks ago. You can go and check that out, on my YouTube channel. And aside from that, I'm on Chad O'Jackson's YouTube channel every Sunday. We do a show called Cutting Through the Culture, 7:30 Eastern time. It's, I think, 6. What is it? You're an hour behind me, Chad, in Texas?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So 7:30 Eastern time. So you guys figure out what time zone you're in if you want to check that out. Me, Chad O'Jackson, and 2 other panelists, Keisha King. You may have seen her on television. Mm-hmm. And our friend Blanchard Robinson, Absolutely. The 4 of us. So, yeah.
Absolutely. You're not getting this on MSNBC, CNN, Fox, whatever. But, thanks a lot, fellas. We'll be in touch. Hope to do a part 2. Definitely want to talk about Malcolm. So, God bless.
Yeah. Oh, man, bring me back or bring us back anytime, man. A dynamic duo, Chuck and Chad. Just put the signal up and we come running.
Absolutely.
Chad is Batman. I'm Robin. I'm the sidekick. I'll tell you
that. Absolutely. God
Chad, you want to plug your films or anything you're doing, man?
Yeah, we did Uncle Tom, which is a documentary that was released in 2020. Uncle Tom 2, which was released in 2022, and we are about to start production for part 3 of that film. We're also working on a film called Comrade Yuri about the information that was revealed by one Yuri Bezmenov in 1984. We had the privilege of going to California and sitting down with G. Edward Griffin, and he gave a lot of insight into not only the whole Yuri Bezmenov interview, but also a lot of things as it relates to social justice and deception and all the things that we talked about in this interview this afternoon. So yeah, excited about that film. Comrade Yuri is actually going to be coming out before Uncle Tom 3. So, but yeah, apart from that, you can find me on Instagram and YouTube. I think that's where I post the most, as opposed to X, formerly known as Twitter. Do a little stuff over there, but all those platforms at Chad O. Jackson.
Absolutely. Keep going, fellas. Thank you for your time today.
For
God,
sure.
God bless.
Anytime.